Hi, how you doing? Okay, this video is about Samhain, aka Halloween, which happens either October 31st or November 1st every year. So right now I'm reading right out of the scriptures. It says, the biggest festival of both witchcraft and our ancient ancestors in Britain, the Celts, the end of the year. So it's a time to celebrate the end of the year. Time to celebrate what has been accomplished that year. The veil between the physical and spiritual worlds is at its most thin moment of the year. So spirits are out, hence the scary theme, to protect. One jack-o'-lantern per child to protect them in the home at night. And then it recommends you read chapter 4 of the 21 Lessons of Merlyn, which is, of course, what I'm going to do. It's like my favorite part of the book. So this book, in case you don't already know, it's one of the sacred books of the Yansui. It's about, because I spend all this time studying Rasta, studying the African shamanistic ways, and it seems like, well, why don't you study your own ancient people's ways? In my case, that's the Celts, the Anglo-Saxon people. I'm French and English both, with a dash of Indian from India. So this is this isn't like the legend of Merlyn. This book's for people that want to know what historical records do we have of the real Merlyn. Like what it's translated from ancient texts to give you the real Merlyn, not the myths about it. But the myths are based on the real Merlyn, so it's really interesting. Of course, J.R. Tolkien had a master's and was a professor in Anglo-Saxon history, so he studied this stuff. It can be kind of a shock to realize that a lot of the things that Gandalf says in Lord of the Rings is actually a direct quote from the ancient scriptures, and it's Merlyn saying it. So, it becomes really obvious that Gandalf is based on Merlyn. Chapter 4, The Haunted Mountain. Okay. The events of summer wandered slowly into autumn, as my anxious hope for Merlin's next visit passed likewise into discernment. So it's called the 21 Lessons of Merlyn because the Catholic Church okayed Merlyn to teach Arthur, because the Catholic Church was in the process at this time in England of forcing everybody to be Christian, forcing everybody to be Catholic. The Romans conquered Britain and were forcing everybody to be Roman Catholic. So they didn't want to necessarily, the Roman Catholic Church always bases its concepts on the religion, the pagan religion that it replaces. That's where all the holidays, that's where probably 75% of the religion comes from. The religion, isn't even biblical. It's just comes from the old ways. So the Catholic Church is how it kept the old ways. Was it okayed Merlyn, and Merlyn promised to a Catholic priest, that he would teach Arthur the old ways, but would not teach him anything bad about the Catholic Church. So Arthur could be a Catholic, but have knowledge of the old ways. And so he did this with 21 lessons. See, that's Merlyn and Arthur. And so each, every, couple times a year, whatever, just growing up, they would meet with Merlyn, and these are the lessons. So this is chapter 4, or in other words, the 4th lesson. See, so that's why it says that. My anxious hope for Merlin's next visit passed likewise into discouragement. He's like, oh, am I ever going to see Merlyn again for the next lesson? Okay. It was not that my enthusiasm towards apprenticeship had all lessened, but only that it was difficult for me to understand why my newfound teacher had apparently chosen to abandon me with so much as a word. After all, I had carefully completed each task with which he had left me. My druidic symbols of mastery were constructed to the best of my ability, and no animal flesh had touched my lips for many months, and every day I washed my new robe in the woodland spring, by which I afterwards meditated on those lessons of magic I had witnessed there, exactly as I had been told. But when empty weeks became lonely months with no sign of another visit, it was little wonder that I began to question whether Merlyn had judged me unworthily to bear responsibility of his teachings. The final days of October were upon Britain, and the fields of pumpkin lay ready for harvest, their bright orange treasures standing hidden amongst the brown nest of tangled vines. No sooner was the harvest completed than delegations began to arrive, as they did each year at that time, to celebrate the high Mass of All Souls' Day at our monastery. Activities were scheduled to begin the following morning, and already 2 priests and bishops had arrived with their many novices to accommodate them for all the duration. Many of us were forced to vacate our bedchambers in favor of sleeping outside under the stars, a sacrifice I never minded, always preferring the accommodations of nature to those of man, and, to my delight, that particular night was no exception. Iltud and I were among the first so required. Our community was especially busy that November Eve, as the number of visitors far surpassed what had been expected. But at last, after all preparations were complete, both saint and sinner lumbered off, thinking only of sleep. I knew the night was a special one, a night all Christian men seemed to fear, a night to remain inside behind fire and hearth, with the door firmly bolted, for it was Samhain. So, of course, Samhain is S-A-M-H, it looks like it says Samhain, is what in Gaelic, what anciently we called Halloween. All Hallows Eve, or All Hallows Eve nowadays, to the followers of the old religion. Many were the times I had laid awake far into the night, listening with strained ears as my older companions whispered tales of demons and deathly spirits which roamed the earth from dusk to dawn, searching for living souls to torment as they themselves were tormented. Even though I found such stories hard to believe, there were mentioned filled with wild longings for adventure, longings that the tales just might be true. Something I did know for certain was that the common folk built immense bonfires throughout the darkest hours, in an effort to keep the forces of the other world at bay. This, at least, I had seen myself. Each Samhain since earliest childhood, I had somehow managed to steal away after everyone was asleep, watching in wonder until dawn as hundreds of fires blazed off the mainland like a sea of giant fireflies in the autumn dark. It was in this very way that I experienced my first real taste of mastery. That particular Halloween being colder than usual, I snuggled deep beneath my mound of woolen blankets, shivering with thoughts of the heavy frost which would surely cover all by morning. My companion in exile, Iltud, had done the same. His heavy breathing told me that he was already asleep just a few feet away. In fact, save for a handful of yellow lamps burning behind shuttered windows, the entire settlement seemed at rest. Overhead, the sky was filled with pools of brilliant stars as I watched intently in hopes of seeing one streak cross the firmament at blinding speed. Then the annual thought of making off to view the Samhain bonfires crossed my mind. While the night air's crisp bite soon convinced me that the idea could wait, after counting my 9th shooting star, I finally passed into a sound sleep. Normally, the quietness of Tintagel on a late fall evening was broken only by the untiring sounds of the sea, or by a choir of crickets in the surrounding meadows. But on that eve, I was roused by a sound distinctly foreign to the island, a ghostly sound of musical design. Still uncertain whether I dreamed or not, the voice of an unseen flute rose clearly above the pre-dawn calm. I threw off my coverings and made a hasty yet uncertain estimate as to the direction from which it came. Aware of how deceptively sound travels on a cold, damp night, my ears soon brought me to the front gate and beyond. Down the road, over the large bridge and onto the mainland. Fortune was with me, for both the gate and the roadway were empty as I passed through the monastery grounds undetected. Only 3 times in my life had I ventured so far from the settlement, and then only to assist a trading party back to Bissany Manor. So acute had my senses become as a result of Merlyn's teachings that neither the slightest sound nor motion evaded my attention as I moved silently toward town. The flute's drifting tones grew louder as the distance from Tintagel increased. All along the way, the fields were alive with fire. Groups of people huddled close to escape the dankness of black superstitions of Samhain. Occasionally, I happened to gatherings of folk dressed in festive colors and wearing grotesquely carven masks, no doubt in an attempt to frighten off the wandering specters of death whose presences were everywhere to be felt that night. And at other places, the roadsides were heavily strewn with the unconscious bodies of men and women who had drunken themselves into a stupor out of sheer terror or dread. All this I noticed without much concern, my main interest still lying in the mysterious music which beckoned me further with each step. Perhaps, I thought, it is the forest god Kurunos, as he bears his reed pipes through the wooded glen upon the cloven hooves. For what could be more natural than to presume his presence on such an occasion? With such superstitions before me, I slowly approached a secluded grove of oak trees, from which I felt certain the music came. The rays of a small fire flittered through the matted leaves. Suddenly, there was a shuffling in the tall grass beside me. I spun around sharply, and there came face to face with a magnificent stallion tied securely to a sapling, his bright eyes darting wildly about the muffled blackness. "Where did you come from?" I started in surprise, freezing instantly as a shadowy figure emerged from behind the horse. "Why, it's mine," came a familiar voice in the answer. "And a good thing, too. You and I will have much need of his swiftness before the night has come to an end." The voice, of course, was Merlyn's. "And what took you so long, young Arthur?" chuckled the druid as he stepped into the night. This time, who is waiting for who, eh? Before having a chance to speak, I ushered inside the grove by the fire, where we slept the next hour, recounting in hushed tones all that had happened since our last meeting. "There will be no further need for fire tonight," said Merlyn, eyeing the flames which had reduced themselves to a pile of glowing embers. "For Mother Moon is plentiful full, enough to see us on our way." Here I noted the Druid was not dressed in his unusual blue robes, but wore instead a black cape, which caused his face alone to be visible against the dark woodline. This I found so out of character that I voiced my question as we prepared to depart. "The color black," he responded while fastening a strap, "is symbolic of the deepest secrets of magic. I wear this color when I wish to become one with the world and not stand apart from it. White represents all that is pure and visible in the sphere of Abrid, while black is a bridge to the other world. Black is the color of true union." Merlyn tossed me a smaller version of his own robe and motioned that I put it on. "Wear this, so that we might join together in the world of mystery this eve," he said while mounting. No sooner had I the garment over my head than a long arm pulled me up onto the steed. With one quick tug of the reins, he sped out over the veld countryside as I clutched madly at the Druid's robe for balance. After what seemed like hours of riding along endless trails, we paused for a moment in a small town where Merlyn commenced to ask time from one of the many villagers busy tending roaring street fires. It was well into the 11th hour before we were out of town and back onto the main road. Thou was the township of Exeter," Merlyn called back against the wind, "which the Romans called Isca de Minorium in times of long past. Our destination lies not too far from here." Despite those words of assurance, I had just resigned myself to another long stretch of road, where the horse was pulled to an abrupt halt. "Behold, we have arrived," the Druid announced loudly, pointing straight ahead. Through a cloud of vapor ushering from the exhausted animal, I made out the silhouette of a broad hill looming before us. "Quickly! We must follow that trail, lest midnight catch us unprepared," he added with a tense edge to his voice. Before I realized what was happening, the horse was hastily tied, and we were making our way uphill along a narrow footpath, skirted on both sides by thick bushes. The air smelled wet and damp like a bog. Moisture glistened over everything in the pale moonlight. Clad in our black raiment, I doubted that even a keep-sighted owl would have detected our passage up that hillside. So much like shadows we must have appeared. Gone were the bonfire legions dotting the countryside. Gone were the masked crowds. Every bend was deadly silent, and I wondered at this. Soon we kept to a sharp fork in the path, where Merlyn paused and said, "Here lies the barrier between the physical world and the other world. Here we must part company for a while, you and I." The druid must have read those expressions of horror across my face at that moment, for he continued at once without permitting me a word in between. Do you understand why it is that the festival night of Samhain is honored by the druids above all others? I shook my head slowly, not certain that I was at all interested in hearing. Because, he continued, it is during this time and no other that the veil separating this world from the other world grows most thin, allowing countless worlds to pass among us with great ease. The time requiring careful control to overcome the fear it generates. As you have witnessed, the common folk now know much of this fear, but little of what is needed to master it. Overstuffed bonfires and saintly prayers are all they know of wandering between worlds this night. But us, we are masters of such things. Masters. I watched in amazement as Merlyn's eyes kindled wildly into the flame for an instant and then died. He took a deep breath and smiled before resuming his typical reserve. You, Arthur, have already tasted victory over the elemental kings. What remains on this eve are the demons of your own mind to conquer, the most formidable forces of all. To triumph in this challenge will earn you the rank of Ovid, the first official order of Druidism, so long as you accomplish it alone and without aid of any kind. I will remain here awaiting your return. Go now. Your destiny lies along that way. Frightened, I started towards the left fork down which Merlyn pointed, knowing that the first critical test of my apprenticeship lie ahead. The concept of try, I thought, no longer applied. This time I would either succeed or fail. As I moved ahead, I could just barely hear Merlyn murmuring some passage or spell under his breath, but it carried well enough through the night air, saying, "Faint night, gleam over this hearth. Ghosts of Arden, pass through and show your distant forms. Misty Loda, house of the spirits of men, when ghosts vanish like mists on a sunny hill, open your doors." Skirting cautiously along the unfamiliar passage, my imagination went wild, sending dozens of chilling memory fragments racing along my spine. What was it Merlyn said, I thought to myself. Ah yes, that extender and its hills used to serve as a Roman stronghold before coming of Maximus. Childhood nightmares began to surface, stories of bloody Roman legions and their merciless attacks against innocent Britons. No single image terrified me more than that of a Roman soldier hiding a bush. And hadn't this very road been trodden into rubble by such barbarians? Even though I knew well the importance of keeping a tight grasp on emotions, my imagination still raced with chaotic thoughts that only a boy could have on an abandoned road. Late at night, alone, at a time when death itself walked abroad, Merlyn used to say, "It is not the task that really mattered, but only one's reaction to it." Trying to put that advice to use only quickened my pace, until a large clearing opened suddenly ahead. As the spot grew closer, there emerged what seemed to be hundreds of small geometric shapes covering the ground, each aglow in the silver light. Not until the clearing stood fully exposed to view did the true horror of my situation become a reality. There before me, vast and silent, lay an ancient graveyard. Located on the very hilltop, it was barren, weedy area about 50 rods square, surrounded on 4 sides by tall hedges of unkept tree and brush. After several minutes, I managed enough courage to walk within arm's length of the tombstones, bending low to study the inscriptions which were still visible on a few. Oh, something in Latin. I won't try to read that. He falls unhappy by a wound intended for another, I translated slowly under my breath, struggling to bring years of schooling into focus. 2 things caught my attention. One was the language and lettering style employed on the carvings, and the other was the name Tassidonius. Somewhere in the deep recesses of memory, that name made a connection, a Roman one. A writer or philosopher, perhaps. No, a leader, an emperor general. Suddenly it all made sense. The place, Isca Dominarium, the Latin letters upon stone, the name Tassidonius, and the desolate appearance of the site itself, as if abandoned by race vanished long ago. Ah, by the gods, Merlyn had sent me into the midst of a Roman graveyard. Just then, the extender church bell tolled out of the hour in the distance. I counted silently as each stroke pierced the damp air. 12 in all. Midnight. Now it was clear why Merlyn had been so keen on reaching our destination in haste. He wanted me there during that dark hour. I stood completely still in the pale moonlight until those 12 ghostly echoes died away. Then, from my right, there came another sound, different still, which turned my blood in my veins to ice. From out of the mists at the very spot where I stood only moments ago, something stirred. A low, painful moan spread over the silence like a wave. As if pushing my way through dark waters, I fought against fear to reach an ancient yew tree at the yard's edge. Climbing quickly onto the lowest bough, I peered out through the thick foliage just as an eerie blue fog began to gather on the surface of the ground. Each gravestone floated above the growing sea, like 1,000 drowning heads waiting to be saved. Amidst it all, a solitary form began to materialize. It was a horrible apparition, clothed in a tattered frock through which its naked bones protruded in places. Being caught between the living and the dead, half in fascination, half in terror, I studied the hideous specter as it wove its way back and forth between the stones. And atop each grave that it passed, there emerged another such creature just as grotesque, which joined at once in the task, like some hellish game of tag. I know not how much time elapsed during the macabre procession, but before long there was no less than 50 of them. Skeletal hands joined together in an ever-expanding ring revolving clockwise. Each time a new corpse surfaced from its tomb, the circle grew larger, until it became clear that the ring would soon engulf the tree where I sat. My heart raced as this cold reality took shape, unavoidably. I was being surrounded by a sea of the dead. Many thoughts of escape occurred to me in those long minutes which followed, but my dread of discovery was far too great. At length it seemed certain that any chance I might once have had to flee was no longer possible. The spirit ring left only a few feet of vaporous space between my tree and the denizens of that nightmarish realm. I could all but smell the rotting flesh beneath their thin shards of clothing. Then, suddenly, the giant dance began to halt. In one unison motion, the specters turned towards my tree, and pointed hundreds of dead hands upward. Unable to contain my fear, I let out one long scream as the yew limb crashed away from under me. When at last I was able to look about, the ghostly multitude had vanished. Rising stiffly, I took a quick survey of my body. No blood. My next concern was to locate the path down which I had come originally. But the mist which still dominated the field made my task nearly impossible. I wandered aimlessly for what must have been a quarter hour before locating what seemed to be the correct route down. Breathing a sigh of relief, I stood upright, only to confront the sum total of all my fears blocking the way. Sinking to my knees in horror, the ghastly form of a Roman soldier stood over me, more imposing than any I had ever imagined. Dressed in battle array, it held high its hand a long sword, dripping scarlet with blood of countless human heads, which lay scattered about its feet. In a strange way, the figure seemed almost familiar, having lurked since childhood behind all of the most fervent nightmares. But this time I knew something was different. This time my nightmare had come upon me for my death. And at that moment I knew beyond all doubt that even a dream at times was enough to kill. From out of this personal hell I remember seeing the face of Merlyn floating among the mists, as if to encourage me onward. Under the eyes of my mentor, I found the renewed conviction for one final effort. Breaking off a dead tree branch, I thrust it valiantly at the supernatural warrior with all my might. In the same instant, the silence was again broken by the extender church bell, as it tolled out one mighty stroke. Instantly the phantom melted into nothingness along with the mist from which it had come. Just as my world faded into the blackest of cold earth, all things were still. I was brought back to life by the impatient hands of Iltude as he tugged and pulled at me through my thick pile of blankets.